Today, we're diving into Buddhist philosophy, but maybe not in the way you'd expect. We're not treating it as a religion that demands belief, but as a really profound, practical response to one of the most fundamental problems of being human, the problem of suffering. So, let's explore this ancient diagnosis and see what it has to say about our modern lives.
I mean, really think about that for a second. You work so hard for something, a goal, a promotion, that thing you've always wanted to buy, and you get it. There's that little burst of happiness, but it doesn't last, does it? Pretty soon, that old familiar feeling of dissatisfaction starts to creep back in. Well, turns out this isn't some new 21st century problem. It's the exact question that kicked off the journey of a young prince named Siddhartha Gautama, the man who would become the Buddha.
To really get what the Buddha discovered, we kind of have to shift our perspective. See, we're not talking about faith or gods here. What we're actually digging into is a 2,500-year-old philosophical system. It was designed to do two things. First, diagnose the root cause of our unhappiness, and second, offer a practical, almost therapeutic path to finding a real, lasting sense of peace. The way the Buddha approached this whole thing was, well, it was like a doctor. You know, before you can ever prescribe a cure, you have to get the diagnosis right. So the very first step is to get crystal clear on the symptom and figure out what's causing it. And that brings us to the core framework of his entire philosophy, the Four Noble Truths. It's just this beautiful, logical, four-part structure. First, you identify the illness. Second, you pinpoint its cause. Third, you realize that, hey, a cure is actually possible. And fourth, you lay out the prescription, the path to get there. So the first noble truth states that there is dukkha. Now, this word often gets translated as suffering, but that's not the whole picture. It's so much broader than that. It's this deep, underlying friction of just being alive, the stress, the feeling that things are never quite right. It's the big stuff for sure, like sickness and death, but it's also that subtle nagging pain of just not getting what you want. Okay, so what causes this dukkha? The second noble truth points the finger at something called tanha. This word literally means thirst or craving, and it's that relentless wanting we all feel. The craving for pleasure, the craving to be somebody, or even the craving to just escape and not exist at all. This right here is the engine that drives our dissatisfaction.
So, why exactly does craving lead to suffering? This question pushes us into the first part of the Buddha's really deep diagnosis of reality itself. It's about the very nature of everything we experience.
The Buddha presents this next idea, not as some kind of belief you have to accept, but as a fundamental law of the universe. It's called anicca, or impermanence. The idea is simple but profound. Nothing, absolutely nothing, is permanent. Everything that comes into being will eventually pass away. You can think of it like scrolling through your social media feed. That stream of content seems endless, right? It just keeps going. But each individual post, each picture, it appears for just a moment and then it's gone, replaced by the next one. Well, our thoughts, our feelings, our bodies, our friendships, they're all part of this same constant flowing stream of change. And this leads us to a really crucial point. If everything is always in flux, then our suffering comes from trying to grab onto things as if they were solid and permanent. We want pleasure to last forever, we want to stay young, we want our loved ones to never leave us. We're essentially trying to hold water in a clenched fist. It just doesn't work. Now, this idea of impermanence leads to an even more radical, maybe even shocking, insight. If everything out there is changing, what about the one thing that feels the most permanent and solid? Our self, that I that seems to be at the center of everything. Well, this investigation doesn't just stop with the outside world, it turns inward. So, Buddhist philosophy actually breaks down the self into 5 different components, or what they call aggregates. You've got your physical body, or form. You've got your sensations, or feeling. There are your mental labels for things, perception, your habits and impulses, or volitional dispositions, and finally, your awareness itself, or consciousness. But is any single one of those the permanent, unchanging you? There's a famous text that uses this brilliant analogy to explain the idea. A sage named Nagasana is being grilled by a king about the nature of his identity. So Nagasana turns it around and asks the king about his chariot. He asks, "Your Majesty, is the pole the chariot? Are the wheels the chariot?" And of course, the king says no to every single part. And that brings us right to the core insight. The word chariot is just a convenient label, a shorthand we use, for a collection of parts that are all working together. There isn't some separate chariot-ness floating around. And in exactly the same way, the word self is just a handy name for those 5 aggregates flowing together in time. There's no permanent, unchanging soul or ego hiding behind them. This is the doctrine of anatta, or no self.
Okay, so if there's no solid self and everything is constantly changing, how does anything even work? What's holding it all together? This question leads us to one of the most profound concepts in all of Buddhist thought, the idea that everything is radically interconnected.
This principle is called pratitya samutpada, or dependent origination. And what it means is that nothing exists in a vacuum. Everything comes into being based on other conditions. A flower can't exist without sun, soil, and water. In the same way, the stress you feel before a big exam isn't just your stress. It arises from this whole web of conditions. The grade, your parents' expectations, the caffeine you drank, how little you slept. This whole principle is mapped out in what's called the 12-link chain of causation, which basically shows how the entire cycle of suffering gets started and keeps going. And it all begins with one thing, a fundamental ignorance of reality, our failure to see impermanence and no self. This one misunderstanding sets off a chain reaction that ultimately leads to birth, old age, suffering, and death.
All right, so we've got the diagnosis. We suffer because we crave permanence in a world that is fundamentally impermanent, and we cling to a self that is ultimately an illusion. Now for the good news. What's the prescription? This is where the third and fourth noble truths come in. Suffering can end, and there is a clear path to make that happen.
The Buddha actually tried 2 extreme lifestyles himself before his enlightenment. First, he tried the path of total sensual indulgence, living like a prince. He found it was, well, ultimately empty and unsatisfying. Then he went to the other extreme, the path of harsh self-denial, starving himself. He found that was just painful and useless. The solution, he realized, wasn't at either extreme. It was right in the middle.
And this middle way isn't just a vague idea. It's a practical program for living called the Noble Eightfold Path. Think of it less as a set of commandments and more as a guide for living wisely. It's often broken into 3 parts. First, there's wisdom, starting with right view, which means truly understanding what we've been talking about. Second is ethical conduct, things like right speech and right action, making sure our behavior aligns with our understanding. And finally, there's mental discipline. This is where you get right mindfulness and right concentration, the active training of the mind to be present and clear, basically turning attention itself into a moral practice.
So when you put all of these pieces together, the diagnosis of dukkha and the prescription of the path, what you end up with is a really profound form of cognitive and, you could say, existential therapy.
And this is a really important point. The goal here isn't to escape from the world or to become some kind of emotionless robot. It's all about re-educating our perception. It's about learning to see things as they actually are, impermanent, interconnected, and without a fixed, solid self. When we see things clearly, our whole relationship with our experiences changes. We don't have to suppress our suffering. We can transform it through wisdom.
Because ultimately, the entire path begins and ends right here, in the mind. This incredibly powerful line from the Dhammapada says it all. It reminds us that our entire reality is shaped by our thoughts. By training our minds to see clearly and act with compassion, we can literally change the fabric of our own experience.
And all of this leaves us with one last, truly fascinating question to ponder. If the self is just a temporary collection of processes, like that chariot, then what is it that carries on from one life to the next in the cycle of rebirth? And when liberation is finally achieved, what exactly is it that becomes free? Now that's a question that has sparked centuries of really profound philosophical debate.